Nephilim 2025, the movie that shocked the world. 1. The Watchers and the Birth of the Nephilim. The tale of the Watchers and the birth of the Nephilim unfolds not simply as myth, but as a profound philosophical meditation on the corruption of order, the perversion of transcendence, and the rupture between being and becoming. It begins not with cataclysm, but with a quiet fracture, a metaphysical deviation, subtle as an unspoken thought, potent as the seed of rebellion. The Watchers, angelic sentinels appointed to steward the boundary between the divine and the terrestrial, gazed upon the daughters of men and saw in them a beauty that stirred the very core of their being. This was not the raw appetite of beasts. It was a higher order's susceptibility to the allure of finitude. In that gaze, time itself seemed to hesitate. Desire no longer base impulse, but metaphysical tension. The longing of the eternal for the temporal crystallized into action. With that choice, the Watchers did not merely descend, they transgressed. Their fall was not physical alone, but ontological, a rebellion against the telos of their creation. They moved from the realm of logos of divine reason and appointed place into the realm of pathos, of passion unbound by limit or law. Samjaza, their leader, foresaw the consequence. He knew this act was not a deviation to be corrected, but an ontological dislocation, an echo destined to reverberate across the very structure of reality. Their union with mortal women was not a blending, but a tearing, an act not of marriage, but of metaphysical violation, wherein divine essence was intermingled with corruptible matter in defiance of both heavenly and earthly categories. From this act emerged the Nephilim, not merely giants in stature, but in symbolic gravity. They were the offspring of contradiction, the synthesis of incompatible orders, the eternal and the transient, the pure and the corrupted. In them was a being too great for the world, yet too fallen for the heavens. They strode the earth not as creatures among others, but as dissonant chords in the music of creation. Their very presence violated proportion, balance, and form. They consumed not just sustenance, but meaning itself. Their voices, like thunder, shattered silence with declarations of might. Divorced from justice, their eyes burned with a light that no longer illuminated, but blinded, a light turned away from the good and toward domination. In the Nephilim, the divine inheritance became a curse. Severed from the divine intention, they became icons of existential excess, symbols of being unmoored from its proper end. Yet their destruction extended beyond acts of violence. It was philosophical, spiritual, metaphysical. With them came forbidden knowledge, not the kind that expands the soul, but the kind that corrupts it. They introduced artifice without ethics. Innovation divorced from contemplation. Metal was drawn from the earth not as an act of cooperation with nature, but as an instrument of domination. Craft devolved into war, ornament into vanity, tools into weapons. Even the mirror, once a reflective surface serving truth, became a gateway to narcissism. What had once been cloaked in reverence became flaunted in pride. Mystery became spectacle. Magic, once a hushed intuition of divine mystery, was vulgarized into a system of control, an imitation of divine will, by those who had forsaken its source. Thus, the world, originally a cosmos, a beautiful ordering, found itself disordered from within. The earth itself, a living participant in the drama of being, groaned beneath the weight of this internal dissonance. Here, then, we encounter not merely a story of fallenness, but of metaphysical catastrophe. It was not simply that individuals sinned, the very order of creation was destabilized. The principle of measure, central to classical and theological metaphysics, was obliterated. The Nephilim lived beyond measure, beyond necessity, beyond limit. Their lives expressed hybris, that pride which denies finitude, the arrogance that rejects participation in the whole. This was not a fall in the traditional sense. It was a dislocation, a becoming unfit for the world they occupied. Their power, divorced from the good, became autonomous, weaponized. They embodied what arises when might detaches from right, when being no longer answers to its source. In them, creation ceased to be sacramental, no longer transparent to divine meaning, and became opaque, impenetrable, dominated by force. Their existence inaugurated a new ontology of violence, wherein the strong devour the weak not as participants in a natural hierarchy, but as metaphysical proclamations that power justifies itself. And men, mortal men, looked upon these beings not with horror, but with admiration. The Nephilim offered a vision of greatness unbound by virtue. Where man had once borne the imago Dei, he now crafted gods in the image of his own fractured desires. Thus, the imago Dei was obscured by the imago Titani, the image of the giant, the transgressor, the one who defies boundary and limit. Idolatry, then, is not merely the worship of the false. It is the philosophical error of mistaking power for divinity, presence for providence, brilliance for goodness. The spiritual ecology inverted. The sacred was profaned, and the profane was enthroned as sacred. What began as a glance of desire culminated in a rupture of being. The Watchers had not only fallen, they had inaugurated an age of disorder, wherein knowledge is divorced from wisdom, beauty from goodness, and power from justice. The earth, once the theater of divine human harmony, became a battlefield of conflicting metaphysical forces. The Nephilim children of the Watchers were not anomalies, but symptoms of a deeper ontological illness, the rejection of limit, the refusal of place, the severance of being from its source. Their birth was not merely biological, but symbolic, a sign of miscreation. The descent of the Watchers was not simply a moral lapse, it was a metaphysical rebellion. In reaching for beauty without goodness, in claiming union without obedience, they committed the primordial philosophical sin to make one's own desire the measure of all things. It is the echo of the ancient temptation, "You shall be as gods." But to grasp divinity while forsaking the divine is to birth monstrosity, to distort the image of heaven until it mirrors the form of hell. Thus, the tale of the Watchers and the Nephilim is no mere myth. It is the anatomy of alienation, the deep grammar of fallenness. It is a metaphysical warning inscribed in the very logic of being, that power without purpose becomes monstrosity, knowledge without wisdom, ruin, beauty severed from the good, a snare. In their rise, the Nephilim demonstrated what it means for creation to break from its creator. In their dominion, the earth groaned, and in their fall, we are reminded that no greatness, no knowledge, no might can stand if it is not rooted in the eternal harmony from which all being flows. 2. Enoch's prophecy and divine judgment. Even amid the cacophony of ruptured order, a world still echoing with the thunderous tread of Nephilim feet and the whispered regret of heaven's exiles, there arose a singular stillness, the silence of the soul that precedes revelation. Out of that hush stepped Enoch, whose very name, initiated, intimates a passage from ignorance to gnosis, from transient sight to apocalyptic vision. He comes not with the trappings of temporal puissance, no crown wreathed his brow, no sword shimmered in his hand, but with the austere authority that belongs only to one who has walked the razor's edge between finitude and eternity. In the philosophical grammar of being, Enoch incarnates the category of logos purified, speech that is simultaneously event, herald, and mirror diagnosing the maladies of existence while disclosing their cure. Against the metallic clang of Nephilim hubris, his voice falls like a plumb line dropped into a disordered cosmos. It reveals at once the depth of deviation and the possibility of rectification. "You sons of heaven," he intones, yet the address slices deeper than mere genealogy, for he confronts the Watchers with the contradiction of their own essence. Creatures formed to contemplate the ineffable, who have collapsed their gaze into concupiscence. Intellects designed to mediate transcendence, who now mediate only corruption. Hence his words are not warnings, but indictments, juridical acts, whose performative force arranges reality around judgment's axis. At that utterance, creation itself responds. Skies contract like a fist around an unsheathed blade. Mountains vibrate with tectonic dread. The air thickens into a pregnant hush, as though materia itself remembers its origin in divine speech and waits to see whether that speech will rescind its gift. Yet in the trembling of the watchers we perceive a paradox. Even fallen spirits retain a vestigial orientation toward the good, a dim instinct that judgment is not arbitrary will but moral geometry. Thus they beseech Enoch, this earthbound interlocutor whose feet stand on soil, yet whose sight pierces the empyrean to mediate for them. Their supplication is itself a tacit confession. That freedom severed from telos dissolves into impotence. That power without obedience cannot secure its own continuance. Enoch ascends not borne by the borrowed luminosity of angelic wings, but by the tensile strength of faith. Faith understood not as private sentiment, but as existential alignment with the true, the good, and the beautiful in their indivisible unity. In that ascent lies a metaphysical drama. Humanity, seemingly the weakest link in the great chain of being, becomes the hinge upon which cosmic justice turns. It reveals that the hierarchy of creation is ordered not by magnitude, but by receptivity to grace. When Enoch beholds the open books, the scene is no mere clerical audit. It is the disclosure of ontology's ledger, where every act is an inscription and every intention a line of ink in the luminous script of eternity. Names appear or vanish according to whether they harmonize with the primal music of the Logos or clash in dissonance. There he sees written a verdict beyond appeal. The progeny of revolt must be unmade, and their progenitors chained to regions of dark fire, where the very heat that once dilated their pride becomes the flame that contracts their freedom into perpetual remorse. Returning to earth, Enoch speaks the sentence, "You will not be granted peace." These words reverberate like a tolling bell whose sound waves shear the veils of time. For peace, shalom, Irene, is not the mere cessation of motion. It is the teleological rest in which each being perfectly answers the question of its existence. To be denied peace is to be denied at the consummation of essence. It is to dwell forever at the threshold of meaning, haunted by the memory of beatitude yet barred from its actuality. Such is a punishment more fearsome than annihilation. For non-being knows no sorrow, but conscious perdition is metaphysical exile, eternal homelessness of the soul. The watchers, in forging an alliance of spirit and flesh disjoined from wisdom, ruptured the sacramental transparency of the cosmos. Now, as retribution, they will experience reality only as opacity, weight, and flame. Creation becomes a mirror, reflecting back the violence they inflicted upon it. Their children, the Nephilim, who once strode as titanic parodies of divine majesty, now sink beneath the cleansing flood of uncreation. Their colossal frames dissolve into sedimentary memory. Their legends, once reverenced, are reduced to warnings etched in mythic sediment. Yet the narrative's force does not terminate in ancient catastrophe. It arcs toward every age, every moment, in which rational creatures toy with the sacred as if it were malleable clay for private designs. Enoch's oracle thus stands as philosophy's moral wake-up call. That curiosity devoid of reverence is intellectual predation. That power severed from the good is self-cannibalizing. That rebellion mislabeled freedom becomes the slave master of its own appetites. Like a syllogism whose conclusion is unavoidable once premises are granted, judgment follows transgression, with an inevitability more exacting than fate, because it is the outworking of reason itself, ratio elevated to cosmic scale. Divine patience is not the weakness of a distant deity, but the mercy of the eternal now extended into temporal sequence, providing space for conversion. When that mercy is spurned, justice flows not as a caprice, but as the restoration of order. Thus the heavens, which once seemed silent amid the blare of Nephilim revelry, reveal in retrospect the profound eloquence of delay. Silence as suspended sentence, quiet as the canvassing of conscience, stillness as the gracious interval wherein freedom might have returned to its origin. Enoch's very existence dramatizes this interplay. He embodies the human vocation to be mediator, not angel, not beast, but the bridge whose span may either raise the world to God or lure the heights into chaos. Thus, the episode functions as an ontological mirror. In the watchers, we discern intellect wedded to desire without discipline. In the Nephilim, power divorced from proportion. In Enoch, speech fused to truth. And in the ensuing deluge, the metaphysical principle that disequilibrium cannot endure indefinitely. Each age reenacts this dialectic in new guises. We craft technologies that mirror the forbidden knowledge of antiquity. We idolize strength detached from virtue. We recast rebellion as authenticity. And we label the prophetic voice irrelevant until the skies darken and the ground trembles beneath the weight of consequences. Yet judgment is never mere negation. It is the violent gateway to renewed harmony. The flood that erases also baptizes. The fiery chains that confine fallen angels inscribe a perimeter within which new creation may flourish. Enoch's prophecy, then, is not a relic. It is an ever-present grammar of history, tracing the arc from hubris to nemesis, from dissonance to imposed silence, from mercy offered to justice rendered. And so the question returns with Socratic persistence. Which voice will we heed, the seductive murmur that calls transgression innovation, or the austere summons that names it folly? In the chiaroscuro of that decision, worlds are born or buried, and every heartbeat echoes Enoch's verdict: peace withheld or peace bestowed, according to the law written in the marrow of being, the law that even the Baba, silence of heaven cannot annul, but only, in its own perfect hour, proclaim. 3. Noah and the Great Flood. Noah's narrative unfolds as the metaphysical hinge upon which a cosmos, swollen with the entropy of defiance, swings from the age of primordial rebellion toward the possibility of renewed harmony. He appears, therefore, not merely as a righteous man in an impious generation, but as a philosophical archetype, the homo fidelis whose fidelity becomes the conduit through which being itself elects to rearticulate its own order. The flood is no arbitrary catastrophe, no meteorological freak writ large. It is the logical terminus of a dialectic that began when the watchers dissolved the ontological boundaries between heaven and earth. Divine patience, often mistaken by cynics as cosmic inertia, operates here as a modal attribute of grace, deferring judgment until every rational creature has had space to reverse its trajectory. But patience, when stretched beyond the tensile limits of moral possibility, must resolve either into mercy received or justice enacted. Thus, the deluge manifests as the moment when forbearance crystallizes into verdict. In that hour, Noah stands like a living syllogism, his deeds, the premises, his deliverance, the conclusion. Scripture's laconic verdict, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his generation, is not hagiographic flattery, but a metaphysical locator pin, marking the one locus in creation where response still mirrors address, where the human amen continues to resonate with the divine let it be. Noah's Ark, then, is more than a maritime craft. It is an epistemological counterstatement to a world drunk on Promethean hubris. The geometry of its dimensions, prescribed by God's own utterance, inscribes sacred proportion upon lumber, translating logos into timber and pitch. Each cubit is a rebuttal to chaos, every peg a syllable in the liturgy of obedience. To the scoffing eyes of a generation enamored with the titanic physiques and weaponized arts of the Nephilim, the Ark embodies folly, an absurd monolith of wood in a landscape not yet inundated. Yet folly, in the Pauline inversion of wisdom, proves the vessel of salvation. The Ark becomes tupos, archetypal form, anticipatory of every sanctuary where chaos is barred at the threshold because obedience has erected walls of covenantal trust. Noah, hammer in hand, fashions more than planks. He shapes a metaphysical refuge, an ontological enclave in which creation's original harmony is not merely preserved, but rehearsed two by two, heartbeat by heartbeat, as animals and family members enter into liturgical procession. Inside, the microcosm of ordered life continues its pulse, even as outside the macrocosm convulses under the hydraulic crush of uncreation. When the skies finally convulse, they do so with a double motion. The fountains of the great deep were burst apart, and the windows of heaven were opened. The language suggests a cosmic rupture both below and above, the sundering of primordial firmaments that once restrained chaos waters at creation's dawn. In philosophical terms, the flood is a temporary suspension of the metaxological order, those mediating intervals that hold opposites in creative tension. Waters from below, the chaotic potential of undifferentiated matter. And waters from above, the transcendent reservoir of form, collapse upon the middle realm of human history, erasing its corrupt inscriptions. Mountains, those silent witnesses to ages vanish beneath torrents. Fortresses of stone, boasting their illusion of permanence, dissolve like salt in the sea. Giants of renown, Og, Gilgamesh, and others whom legend will half remember, discover their sinews as feeble as wax before a foundry. Power shorn of virtue reveals itself as weight without structure, mass without meaning. The Nephilim, whose very existence once broadcast an ontology of excess, drown beneath the very excess they embodied, too heavy for transcendence, too hollow for endurance. Meanwhile, within the ark's dimly lit corridors, reverence rather than triumph reigns. Noah does not gloat over the annihilation of his antagonists. His gaze, filtered through the small window permitted by divine design, sees only the unrelenting gray of judgment's waters and feels the trembling timbers beneath each wave's assault. His heart becomes a metronome of gratitude and grief, keeping time with both divine mercy and cosmic mourning. The ark itself assumes a dual symbolism, tomb and womb. As tomb, it inters the old world's hubris, sealing within its hold the morticians of violence. For all outside is sepulchral sea. As womb, it shelters the germ of renewed creation, holding in gestational suspense the seeds human, animal, vegetal of a respoken order yet to be born. 40 days of rain and 40 nights of hemorrhaging sky amount to more than meteorological duration. They represent, in biblical numerology, the completeness of trial, the arithmetic of transformation. Time inside the ark stretches into a contemplative crucible, annealing faith under pressure even as the world is baptized in judgment. At last, silence. The rain abates. The primal thrum of water against hull fades to a whisper. Yet silence here is not peace. It is the ontological blankness that follows deconstruction. A hush pregnant with either new logos or final void. Noah releases a raven, scavenger of corpses, and it circles upon winds still scented with death's residue, announcing that the old order's decay has not yet surrendered its last effluvia. Only when the dove returns with an olive leaf does hope take tangible form, a green semaphore of reconciling intent, the first liturgical vestment of the newborn earth, the ark comes to rest upon Ararat, its keel kissing rock like lips to altar. Gravity itself now participates in benediction, drawing vessel to mountain as mercy draws judgment to close. Emerging, Noah does not inaugurate the new age with city founding or monument erecting, those typical gestures of human self-assertion. Instead, he builds an altar. Sacrifice becomes the primal act of renewed humanity, a philosophical acknowledgement that life can sustain meaning at least when offered back to the source. The burnt aroma ascends, and Scripture dares to describe the infinite, breathing the finite's fragrance, a theophany of divine pathos, wherein God covenants never again to deluge the earth in total judgment. The rainbow straddling cloud and sun materializes as covenant's chromatic arc, a transphysical sign that the bow of war has been hung in the heavens, string relaxed, arrowless. Yet even this promise carries dialectical tension. Judgment is stayed, not abolished. Mercy, not naivete, girds divine resolve. The flood thus functions as both memory and warning, an epical punctuation mark reminding every subsequent generation that creation operates on a moral syntax, and that syntax can be violated only at catastrophic cost. Noah's life after the waters, his planting of vineyards, his vulnerability, his blessings and curses upon his progeny, illustrates that the problem of evil cannot be drowned, yet it reemerges in the very heart that survived, because the ark transported not only righteousness, but also the enigmatic potential for relapse. Yet this does not nullify the flood's significance. Rather, it sharpens its philosophical edge. Redemption is inaugurated, not consummated, in any single historical act. The cosmos will require further covenantal episodes. Sinai's thunder, Calvary's quake, Eschaton's fire each, echoing the pattern of chaos confronted, order pronounced, and freedom invited into alignment. Noah, therefore, is both father of the post-diluvian world, an icon of the perpetual pilgrim, the one who walks the thin line between memory of wrath and anticipation of grace. His legacy whispers to every builder of arks, be they cathedrals of stone, scientific paradigms, or communities of solidarity, that true construction is always an act of listening before hammering, of receiving before giving, of aligning the angles of human craft with the curvature of divine intention. Thus the deluge ceases to be a quaint Sunday school tale and reveals itself as a metaphysical parable, waters as liquid judgment, ark as embodied logos, rainbow as chromatic logic of covenant. In Noah, faith becomes epistemology, obedience, ontology, sacrifice, the grammar of existence. The floodwaters recede, but the question they pose remains ever proximate. Will humanity interpret divine patience as license for renewed rebellion or a space for repentant creativity? For judgment postponed is not judgment revoked. It is merely the interval wherein arks may yet be built, altars yet erected, rainbows yet interpreted as invitations to live within the wavelengths of mercy. The aftermath and return of giants. History's shattered tablets remind us that cataclysm may scour a landscape clean, but it cannot purge the marrow. And so the flood receded while the metaphysical residue of transgression clung like silt to the blood of humankind. Legacy, after all, is the subterranean river that outlasts both deluge and drought. Thus, within the genealogical lattice sprouting from the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, there lingered a cryptic code, a faint yet potent syllable of primordial rebellion, mutated but unextinguished. Scholars of sacred narrative have long debated whether this contagion traveled through the line of Ham darkly foreshadowed in the curse of Canaan, or by more occult diffusion among all branches of post-diluvian humanity. Yet whatever conduit carried the ember, the effect became visible in the rise of the Anakim, Rephaim, Zamzumim, and other clans whose very names rumble with pre-Mosaic dread. These were not Nephilim redux in sheer colossal form. Creation's new physics, tempered by covenant, refused a second outbreak of that ontological extravagance. And yet, they were tall enough, strong enough, and more critically spiritually resonant enough with the old transgression to incarnate its ethos of hybris in scaled down but no less disruptive form. They built citadels that scratched the limestone sky of Canaan. Walls of cyclopean stone bore spiral motifs echoing a forgotten sorcery. Altars exhaled rites that bent the moral grain of the universe. In them, the pre-flood aspiration to sever power from purpose re-emerged as cultural memory encoded in architecture, ritual, and warcraft. They were living palimpsests, blood-bound rehearsals of angelic lust and human complicity. Their cities resounded with the same bass note of defiance that once summoned the deluge. Into this charged topography marched the children of Israel, ex-slaves turned pilgrims, carrying within their ark of acacia wood not only stone commandments, but the fragile possibility of a society ordered by covenant rather than domination. Their exodus from Pharaoh's brick pits had been a polemical drama against empire. Their entry into Canaan would become a polemical drama against something more ancient than empire, the residual metaphysics of the Watchers. When Moses sent 12 spies to reconnoiter the land, the act became an epistemological test. Could the emancipated imagination behold citadels of terror and still remember the grammar of promise? 10 spies failed that test. Their optic nerve, trained by generational trauma, magnified the stature of the Anakim until perception calcified into fatalism. We were as grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in theirs. Their report exemplifies a philosophy of vision corrupted by fear. Ontology shrunk to accommodate anxiety. Reality narrated by the loudest dread. But Joshua and Caleb, tutored in an alternate anthropology, answered with a counter-epistemology. They are bread for us. In that utterance, giants became nourishment. Threat became sacrament. Their words did not deny the empirical fact of towering opponents. Rather, they reconfigured the fact within a horizon where covenantal fidelity, not brute size, determines destiny. Here lies an abiding dialectic. Corrupted might thrives on the acquiescence of smaller souls. Redeemed vision, by contrast, metabolizes even menace into maturation. The narrative thus loops back to a primordial motif. A minority voice, attuned to divine cadence, contests the hegemony of fear, and history swivels upon that contested pivot. Under Joshua, the Hebrews cross the Jordan, a liminal act mirroring Noah's emergence from the floodwaters, and confront Jericho, whose walls loom like stone transcripts of pre-flood hubris. The walls fall not to siegecraft, but to sound, trumpet blast, ritual silence, and sacred procession. Obedience becomes metaphysics, liturgy reconfigures topography. Power detached from righteousness proves brittle. Trust aligned with awe, transcendent order becomes tectonic. The subsequent campaigns against Lachish, Hebron, Debir form a slow deconstruction of the giant legacy, city by city, clan by clan. Israel's advance becomes a kind of reverse archaeology, stripping away fossilized rebellion to unearth primal harmony. Yet the warfare stretches across generations, for legacies, once embedded, rarely yield to a single trumpet or sword. Anakim fortresses persist in Philistine strongholds. The Rephaim Valley remains a mnemonic scar south of Jerusalem. The covenant people thus learn that faith's vocation is not episodic heroism, but perennial vigilance. Into this simmering continuity stride the figures of Samuel, Saul, and finally David. David's advent in the Valley of Elah reframes the giant motif in its most iconic form. Goliath of Gath, armored in bronze platelets like scaled memory of antediluvian titans, taunts with recycled rhetoric size equated with sovereignty, noise mistaken for normativity. David answers not with counter-intimidation, but with a sling, 5 stones, and a theological thesis. The battle is the Lord's. The stone that breaches Goliath's brow does more than conclude a duel. It punctures a centuries-old ontology inflated by fear. The arc that began with Samjaza's descent meets its antithesis in a shepherd attuned to transcendent order. The event affirms a perennial truth. The universe's grain favors kenosis over cacocracy, humility over hypertrophy. And yet, Scripture does not romanticize the aftermath. David's reign, though luminous, teems with entanglement. Giants reappear, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, Lami, each subdued not by David alone, but by his cohort of mighty men. Communal courage becomes the new vanguard against periodic flare-ups of the old infection. The Chronicles articulate a doctrine of historical recurrence. Corrupt power can be exiled, but not eradicated until history meets its telos. The prophets transpose this martial imagery into ethical summons. Isaiah envisions swords beaten into plowshares. Micah dreams of a peace where the memory of giants is no longer operative. Meanwhile, the wisdom tradition internalizes the battle. Proverbs locates Anakite arrogance within the human soul. Pride precedes a fall as surely as Goliath preceded his. Thus, the aftermath of giants becomes not a clean conclusion, but a philosophical mirror reflecting every age's struggle with aggregated might. Institutions ossified in sin, technologies decoupled from conscience, narratives of dominance that haunt the cultural imagination. Whether the towers be ziggurats, skyscrapers, or digital code, the question remains: who narrates reality? Those who see only the height of the walls, or those who discern the deeper architecture of promise? Legacy becomes a double-edged inheritance. It can perpetuate the tremor of rebellion or transmit the echo of faith, depending on which blood memory a generation chooses to animate. The biblical witness ends not with Canaan purged of every giant, but with a horizon, a vision wherein lion and lamb share pasture, where domination gives way to Sabbath peace. Until that eschaton, the sons and daughters of the covenant remain, like Joshua and Caleb, minority reporters of hope amid data that screams dread. They walk cities shadowed by figurative Anakim systems swollen with inequity, idols swaddled in neon, fortresses of self-interest scaling ever higher, and they must decide again and again whether to echo the 10 or the 2. For giants, as Canaan discovered, are not merely felled by sharper blades, but by clearer sight that calibrates every human measurement against the plumb line of divine vocation. The narrative spanning from antediluvian collapse to monarchic confrontation leaves us with an unfinished symphony. Its final cadence awaits the one conductor who will reconcile might and mercy into a definitive harmony. Meanwhile, the rumble of giant footsteps recedes, yet never fully vanishes. It becomes a basso continuo beneath history's fugue, a reminder that judgment may drown corruption and faith may confront intimidation. But only the vigilance of covenantal imagination can sustain a world until peace is no longer promise, but presence. 5. David and the final fall of the giants. David's encounter with Goliath, often sentimentalized as an underdog vignette, is in truth a confrontation between rival ontologies, a clash not merely of champions but of worldviews. On the Philistine side stands Goliath, the final great avatar of an ontology grounded in mass, momentum, and intimidation. His bronze-scaled armor glints as a homily to material supremacy, a visible theology of domination. On the Israelite side stands David, a youth whose curriculum vitae includes solitude, song, and vigilant care for vulnerable sheep, yet whose inner architecture is ordered by the quiet logic of covenantal trust. The Valley of Allah thus becomes a liminal amphitheater wherein competing metaphysical claims vie for interpretive hegemony. Goliath advances, each footfall a manifesto. Being is force, value is volume, and destiny belongs to the loud and the large. David's reply does not deny the empirical magnitude of the Philistine. Rather, it relativizes it, subsuming the spectacle of scale beneath a higher referent. You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh Spaot. Philosophically, this is a recalibration of causality itself. Secondary causes, metal, muscle, momentum, are not denied, but neither are they ultimate. Primary causality, the purposive, initiating will of the Creator alone, determines the trajectory of history. Guided by this conviction, David's sling stone becomes sacramental, a pebble of ordinariness transfigured into a projectile of transcendence, traversing the space between two ontological postures and lodging itself in the forehead of pretension. Goliath's fall is thus not merely a tactical success, but the collapse of a cosmology. The architecture of intimidation crumbles under the weight of one well-aimed act of faith. That first toppling initiates a wider exorcism. Goliath is but the visible node in a network of residual gianthood. Ishbi-Benob, armed with a spear whose bronze tip weighs 300 shekels. Saf, looming like a living dolmen. Lami, brother of Goliath, with a spear shaft like a weaver's beam. And the six-fingered, six-toed specter of Gath, each digit, a grotesque echo of antediluvian excess. Yet what begins with David's sling finds its consummation in ordinary warriors. Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, Jonathan, son of Shammai, whose names flicker briefly in Scripture, not marked by mythic aura, but by the quiet internalization of David's vision that giants are not problems of size, but of misplaced fear. With that recalibrated perception, Anakite enormity becomes brittle. These remnant behemoths fall not in angelic spectacle, but in gritty proximity. Each defeat dissolves another psychological foothold of terror. The cumulative result is a slow disenchantment. The spiritual atmosphere, once thick with the residual smoke of pre-flood rebellion, is ventilated by successive acts of covenantal courage until the giant, as existential archetype, is rendered obsolete. Here, theology converges with moral philosophy. Evil's durability, the text insists, is less a function of intrinsic might than of its capacity to evoke awe. Shatter that spell and its stature collapses. David's descendants are trained to perceive disproportion through the lens of divine promise rather than the lens of inherited panic. Each battle becomes an act of re-narration, where weapons are recontextualized as opportunities for covenantal trust. In the practical realm, swords clash, blood is spilled, tunics are soaked, but the decisive battleground remains interior, where the imagination must choose between capitulation to spectacle or fidelity to the unseen order. The chronicler affirms this subtle epistemology. The giants die not amid thunderbolts, but in prose unembellished, unromantic. Their banality becomes their undoing. No divine pyrotechnics, no dramatic flourish, only the steady, embodied fidelity of those who refuse to be ruled by scale. In their plain demise, mythic terror is reduced to skirmish. And in this demythologizing the Watcher's legacy, the enthronement of hypertrophic power as ontological norm is quietly erased. And yet, the narrative avoids naive triumphalism. David, the one who toppled Goliath with faith in stone, later falters before more insidious giants. Desire ungoverned, senses driven by pride, familial chaos untamed. The text thus deepens rather than dilutes its thesis. It is alignment with divine order, not tactical brilliance that adjudicates true victory. The more fearsome giants, perhaps, are those housed within. In this, Goliath becomes metaphor. Civilizations, systems, ideologies that prize spectacle over substance will in time meet their pebble. Their end often comes not through a brute force, but through a shepherd's gaze trained on a different center of gravity. History reprises the same dialectic. From bronze-clad titans to algorithmic behemoths, the hypertrophic invites recalibration. When self-aggrandizement displaces communal good, the sling will eventually fly. Such reproportioning arises not from rebellion, but from imagination schooled in an invisible realism, one where size is not sovereignty and appearance is not authority. By the time the chronicler sets down his pen, the bones of the giants have long since powdered into Judean soil. Their cities are ruins or reassignments, their names placeholders in a liturgy of warning. The Watcher's project persists in the penumbra of ambition, but their terrestrial avatars, those who once stomped fear into villages, are gone. Undone not by angels, but by faith-formed mortals. The logic is plain. Power uncoupled from telos decays. Faith tethered to justice regenerates. Thus, the valley where Goliath fell is more than a geographical coordinate. It is a philosophical axis, a recurring archetype. It reminds every age that the real contest is not brawn versus nimbleness, but intimidation versus integrative vision, hubris versus hope. The covenant community survives not by might, but by alignment, by saying yes to the grain of the cosmos, even when bronze armor blinds the eye. In that quiet consent lies the true undoing of giant logic. The final exorcism, then, is not merely tactical, but ontological, the surrender of inflated identity to the clarity of purpose. The giants fall, not just in history, but in heart and culture whenever a shepherd's courage outlives a warrior's threat. The sling of faith, though small and often scorned, remains the quintessential tool for restoring scale to truth and bringing swollen pretensions back into proportion with a reality whose final word belongs not to fear, but to fidelity.